guys, it's Sam, and this is the start of a series I'm going to be doing here on my channel about my favorite tropes. So this is going to be my favorite tropes in media in general because I can see myself pulling in other media, but right now I'm just sticking to books, maybe going back to other media, but for right now I'm just sticking to books because I just need to contain this. But for a while now I've been wanting to talk about some of my favorite tropes and specific tropes. So not just like anti-heroes or like the really overarching tropes that are like very, very broad. I'm talking like really niche specific tropes. I actually started doing this kind of series thing back a couple of years ago, like 2016, when I started talking about Hades and Persephone. I did a whole video talking about what I loved about Hades and Persephone, what kind of elements I really liked, what elements I like seeing in books, etc. And for some reason, I had put this off because I was like, oh, if I do a video about my favorite tropes, I need to have recommendations for those books that have those tropes. The thing is, with a lot of my favorite tropes, an element will exist within like one book, but it's not necessarily like the trope in its perfection. This is the problem I've run into with Hades Persephone. So for those of you that have asked, because plenty of you have, about like a Hades Persephone recommendations video, it's not going to happen for a while because I want to do a second part to that video with recommendations that I actually recommend, not just books that have like an element here and there. So next year, I think 2019 is going to be my year of like reading all of the Hades Persephone because I'll have time because I'll be out of graduate school, and actually finding like the recommendations that I give. But anyway, these are going to have a couple of recommendations that fall into there, but mostly I'll be talking about the kinds of things that I like to see within these tropes, and if you guys have any recommendations for them. But overall, I'm not even necessarily looking for recommendations. I'm just going to talk about what I like about these particular specific tropes. So you can look forward to seeing these kinds of book chats on the regular here on my channel. And today I want to talk about one of my favorite tropes, and that is villain and main character enigmatic dynamics. So this is not shipping specific. So it's not romantic dynamics that I love, although I'm okay with that. It is just the dynamics of the villain and the main character interacting and how they interact with each other and what the power balance is and all of that. It's different than if you have like this overarching main villain. So this is about villains that are specifically more of the main character's nemesis. So not just like this overarching bad guy and the main character's kind of a pain in their butt, but like overall they're not like, this is like nemesis level, okay? Sometimes there's romantic tension, it happens, but a lot of times there's not. This is something I love. If the main character and the villain get to like really interact, and what I really like about this trope specifically, and I don't even have a name for it, like what, I'm just calling it this, you know, enigmatic dynamic relationship between the main character and the villain of a story. But what I really like about this specifically is the power dynamic, the power differential. So what I like seeing with these interactions and with these characters and when they're kind of like facing off and they're a nemesis is there is a certain level of respect for each other. Not necessarily that they respect and like, oh, I'm going to be kind to you. Like, they know the other one is a formidable foe. I really appreciate that. So they both have a respect for the other one that comes out in like, okay, we are fairly equally matched. Yes, sometimes the villain feels a little bit more insurmountable because whatever, but like generally speaking, you see as the reader that these two are kind of the yin and yang, fairly evenly matched, the, you know, the good versus the evil, that kind of dynamic that I really like. Something else that also comes into play with this, and I will use a line from a book that I'm going to talk about in a second with this, but the whole like calls to like. I just really enjoy that. So there's something about these characters that even though they're on opposite sides, there's similarities there. And there's a realization either for you as the reader or even with the characters that they kind of know that if things might have been a little different for either side, that they might have been on the same side, you know? Like, they know that they are two sides of the same coin, or they have similarities, or they have personality traits that are similar, or something. They are, again, that kind of like yin and yang, like calls to like dynamic. I also really like that this kind of lends itself to the pull to the dark side thing. I like when people struggle with their humanity, and especially when a main character, whether they're an anti-hero or just like a standard typical hero, are kind of tempted ever so slightly by the dark side. There's something that I really enjoy about characters, even if they never do, going dark and possibly crossing that line. I think about that with a lot of my favorite main characters, and specifically main characters that have these kinds of relationships with their villain counterpart. Because even if it's not romantic, there's something there where they feel like maybe they could cross over, maybe they could embrace that side of themselves, and I really like that dynamic. I like it typically when they don't end up doing that. Like, I haven't read a lot of like actual villain stories that I don't find incredibly tropey, where they actually turn into a villain and it's a trope, but I do like that whole dynamic being explored of like, will they, won't they, can they, you know, who are they, figuring out their morals, where they stand, things aren't so black and white, etc., etc. So I do have a couple of examples for this trope specifically. One is Clara and Anise from Winterspell by Claire Legrand. One thing I really loved about this book was the dynamic between these two. They kind of walk the line in here between being friends and like maybe something more. Like, there's that kind of element. There's definitely the element of Clara being sort of tempted by the bad, understanding kind of where Anise is coming from, them having similar personalities. Anise sometimes pulling out elements of Clara's personality that she wishes she would let out more often. Stuff like that that I really like. I thought their dynamic was incredibly thought-provoking and just really interesting and compelling. I also really like the dynamic between Queen Alyssa and the Red Queen in the Queen of the Tearling series. At least even in the first book, and not even in the second book, they haven't even met, but there is a mutual respect for the other one. These are two very powerful women in their respective countries, and they kind of sort of understand each other. The Red Queen, even though Alyssa is a younger queen, understands that she holds a certain kind of power, isn't just looking down on her and being like, oh, this stupid girl doesn't know anything. Like, she knows that she is a formidable foe, and they both treat each other with a certain level of respect and know that they could be on the same page in a different situation. So there is that really interesting element of them facing off against one another and being very equal in that. I also really liked the Comas and Leah in The Heart of Betrayal, which is the second book in the Remnant Chronicles by Mary E. Pearson. And this villain, again, there's no romantic dynamic with them or anything like that, but he recognizes her as an intelligent asset. At the time, she is near his court and stuff, and he uses her at times as a pawn, but also understands that she is a valuable piece in his puzzle, and he doesn't necessarily underestimate her in any way. I think there is an element of things getting away from him, but I think that their dynamic is very interesting, and again, he understands her intelligence and has a certain level of respect for that. So I would have liked to even see more of their interactions in this series, because I thought that the conversations that they had and the way they played off each other was really good. And lastly, the like cream of the crop as far as books go for this dynamic is Alina and the Darkling from the Gersha trilogy. Like, everything that I want in a villain main character dynamic is here. Yes, I ship them romantically, but also just like, there's so much to just chew on with this. Definitely, obviously, like I mentioned, the like calls to like line is from this series. So they are two sides of the same coin. She's a sun summoner. He conjures darkness, the Darkling. They are that visually, which is just something that's like really appealing. But also throughout, yes, he's trying to control her, but he also recognizes her level of power. And as the series goes on, also gets that like, oh crap, he wanted to get her at the beginning to be able to like mold her into what he wanted, and as he realizes that she is out of his grasp, he's like, oh shit. And it's beautiful, because there's so many lines, like there's so many things that happen that I wish I could talk about, but I won't because it's spoilers for this actual video. But like, so many things that happen throughout this series where it's very evident that he does respect her power on a certain level, even though he has a lot of pride and he's like, oh, I'm the most powerful thing ever. He knows that she is a weakness and a weak point, and that he and her could be equals. There's even lines where he's like, there's a second throne on that days, and all this stuff that is really good for shipping material, but is just important also for a villain main character dynamic and a hero dynamic. She is sometimes pulled by that darkness, by the like evil side of things, by wanting to do a bad thing for the right reason, that kind of thing. Like, darkness is very compelling sometimes, and he is very much that. And it's just a really interesting, like, their interactions are so interesting. They don't even need to be in the same room, and the way they refer to each other, talk about one another, respect each other, even throughout the whole series, beginning to end, there is this dynamic that is so compelling to watch and is so interesting, because the Darkling is a great villain on his own, but I think his interactions with Alina is what really makes this series for me, because it's just everything that I eat up about a main character and villain interaction. Again, you can take away the romantic element to it, the romantic shipping element that is brought in by a lot of us, and just if you just had them interacting as just villain and main character, it's basically flawless for me. When you have main characters coming into their own and really facing off against a formidable villain, and they are equals in that way, it's beautiful. So those are some of my favorite villain and main character enigmatic dynamic relationships. Comment down below and let me know some of your favorites if you also like this trope, and if you have any recommendations for me where you have these like nemesis interactions, towing the line between love and hate, but not necessarily in a romantic way, all of that kind of stuff. I eat that up as far as villains go, so comment down below and let me know. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.